Okay. Well, last week we started to talk about we talked about truth the first week, obviously how we know truth, what is truth, can we know truth, some of the barriers to truth, because if you can't know truth, then you're not going to be able to truth about God. So that makes creates quite a problem if you don't think you can know truth or think that there's just no way to know anything. Um, so that's why we veered into last week starting to talk about how we can know the truth about God. And then this week we're going to continue with that. There's a lot to cover on this. I'm probably going to do a third week next week because there's just so much, we could go on and on. But um, I talked a little bit last week about communication, and I said that, with humans, we have certain kinds of communication. And I said how we, we use these communications in every day of our lives. This is the way we form relationships. It's the way anything gets accomplished. We have verbal communication, we have visual communication, which we've been talking about. We have written communication. All these kinds of communication are essential for us to know anything about anyone, right? We don't have knowledge of anybody without these forms of communication. Then I said that, when you're thinking about God, um, some people come along and say, well, I just don't know if we can know anything about God. I'm not sure how we would know if there's a God. I don't think we can know there's a God. Or, I'm not sure if I want to know there's a God, so that they're talking about knowledge of God. How do we have knowledge of God? That's what it means to know. Just like I have relationships with people, I know them, I have knowledge about them, and I know them personally. But the question is whether God has decided to communicate. Okay. How is he given knowledge of himself? Because if he doesn't pick some method of communication, we wouldn't know anything about him. So some Christians or some people in the world around us think that they are the ones who tell God the way he's supposed to communicate to us, and they have the right to tell God, how he's going to communicate with us. You might say, well, why doesn't he write it in the sky? Why doesn't he make it totally obvious? Why doesn't he just create a lightning bolt that comes down in front of me? Or why doesn't he make it so obvious that he's there? And the problem with that is that we don't seem to understand that God's not just interested in us um, being amazed, like saying, "Oh yeah, I had that lightning bolt, or I had this thing, and there's some kind of God, and I'll just think about it for a long time." No, God's after a moral transformation. After us. He's after our yieldness. He wants us to yield over to Him and be willing to turn our lives over to Him. But a lot of times we assume, if we get that perfect sign that that we're just going to yield our lives right over to God. But that doesn't work because we know all throughout the Bible God revealed himself very clearly to people, like the golden calf incident with Israel. They went right into idolatry after he showed them many things, like parting the Red Sea. We know Jesus did miracles for people, they still didn't believe. So there's all kinds of instances where people got their signs or whatever they required of God, and it didn't really change their heart at all. So the demand from the skeptic that he deserves more evidence from God is arrogance, to be honest. So, and quite frankly, God's not really obligated to give you any more evidence. So, you're not especially, there's nothing unique about you that makes you different from everybody else. So you deserve more evidence or you deserve a sign. You don't deserve anything. Really, God doesn't have to do anything if he doesn't want to. He's already spoken and communicated, and you're not responding to that. You think you're smarter than him, or you think you demand more, but in the end, you're just going to get more and more frustrated. And the only way that you're going to make any headway is if you start humbling yourself before him and start saying that I'm willing to look at the communication you've given and I'm willing to think about it and yield to that versus you demanding him what he's supposed to do. Okay. Now, we've been talking a little bit about visual communication. We talked about how God uses the things in the created order he's made, things that we can observe with our five senses or use our five senses. We can see, touch, feel, or smell, whatever it is. Obviously, we can't taste God, but the point is that God has used certain things in the created order. He's created things that we can see his effects. And I talked last week a little bit about how God's not a physical thing. He's not a car, house. He doesn't fit into that category. Like everything in your room around you is physical. He doesn't fit into that. You can't measure God. You can't, he's not a material thing. He's not a physical thing. You can't pull out your tape measure and measure how far he is, and you can't put him in a physical container. So God doesn't fit into that category. Okay. He's a different being. Okay. And so we can't expect God to appear to us like these cars and houses and other things, like everything we see. But we do obviously observe God's effects in the world. We can observe his effects. That's what we see. We look at the effects in the world and we looked at the effects and we asked what the cause is and whether there's an intelligent mind behind those effects. Okay. And most humans throughout history have inferred design that's intuitive to a lot of people. I talked about that. Um, there's very sophisticated design arguments, there's very basic design arguments. And obviously, we've been talking about some of those, just started to. Now, there was a movement that started a ways back. Um, I mean, the design arguments have been around a long time, but the intelligent design movement started back in the 80s or so. I think it was the late 80s or somewhere around there, somewhere in the 80s, the actual movement called intelligent design. I mean, design arguments have always been there, but this was a movement that got started to. Part of the issue was that the evidence began to come in the sciences that it looked more like there was evidence for some kind of designing intelligence more than there used to be. There just more information came out. People were writing about it, and it obviously caused a controversy in the whole evolution debate. Where many people thought evolution was a closed case and there's no God, and evolution has disproved God, which never would be true anyway. But a lot of people thought that was a closed case, and therefore, when the intelligent design movement came along, it began to challenge that. It pushed back against the view that a mindless process could produce everything around us, all the complexity of life, that a mindless process could give us a universe, that a mindless process could give us an earth hospitable to life, that a mindless process could get life going, that a mindless process could create the reproductive system, that a mindless process could come up with DNA and come up with molecular machines in your body, and a mindless process could come up with a reproductive system. It just goes on and on. So those began to get more and more challenging, and this movement got going. And really, all intelligent design says that there are some objects, sometimes you can look at it a few different ways, that there might be an object or event that can't be the result of an unguided natural process. Okay, meaning unguided means no mind, no intelligence. It just somehow nature figures it out on its own. Nature can just do anything, doesn't need any mind behind it. Nature just does all kinds of things. It just has a mind of its own. Or you might say an event or object can't be the result of chance or coincidence. Some people like to say that chance causes things. Well, give it enough chances and chance this and chance that, but they tend to forget that chance isn't a cause. Chance doesn't do anything. Chance has no power to do anything. Chance is just a statistical probability level that people calculate of something happening without a mind behind it. If I pull out 25 quarters and I say, here are the chances of them landing heads or tails, the probability level, I am assigning the probability level, right? But I'm flipping the coin. Okay. And then some people still think the chance is just able to do things on its own, like it just has power or something. Doesn't work that way. Yes, chance things can happen, but it doesn't mean that chance caused it. Okay. Um, and then of course, intelligent design basically just means there's a being with the ability to plan ahead, think ahead, and has a goal in mind. We're all intelligent agents, really, as humans. We all are, right? And we plan things out. We have then goals. We plan our lives. We try to plan our future. We think ahead and we have specific goals, right? And that's all really intelligence is. I mean, you think about intelligent design, it's just the same thing. Um, So it's just a goal directed process that of attributing like a mind intelligence behind the universe or the earth or the human body or certain features of reality. We think that there's an intelligence behind that versus a non undirected natural process. Okay, this mind has forethought, intentionality, and it can look ahead and do things. Okay, and plan ahead and execute. Right. So I talked a little bit last week. I said, we observe effects in the world around us, and then we talk about what's the cause of that. And I talked about we observe cause and effect relationships. We see that all the time. If I use the illustration, I said in my room right now, if a baseball comes to the window and lands on the bed, breaks the window, I'm going to say that's the effect. I'm going to get up from my table, go over to the window, look to see what's the cause. Did someone throw it? Did the ball just somehow get up on its own from the grass and somehow throw itself through the window? Obviously, I'm going to infer there's probably a human who threw that ball through the window intentionally or unintentionally. So that's what we do. We look at cause and effect relationships all the time. So when evolution came along, as far as Darwinian evolution, it really was viewed as a replacement for a designer, kind of like something to get rid of any kind of creator, or it kind of like what what Darwin came up with was somehow like a natural selection and mutation process, kind of mimic design. It looks like it's designed, but it's not designed by a god or anything. It just mutation, natural selection would be the cause of all apparent design, but there's no mind behind that. There's no God behind that. It just does it on its own. So a lot of people came to see, well, whatever the design features are in the biological realm or the world around us are the result of mutation, natural selection. And so that's been the view for a long time. Some people obviously have left that view. There's a lot of challenges to it. Um, and really what happened was that when intelligent design came along, they began to challenge what science is, like how we're defining science, because for the most part, the way science is done, methodologically speaking, is that science pursues only material or naturalistic explanations. It looks at physical things, it comes up with physical explanations, or it looks for natural explanations. It doesn't allow God in the mix, it doesn't allow intelligence in the mix, it doesn't allow an intelligent mind. It's completely looking for naturalistic explanation or material explanations. And so intelligent design kind of came along in definition number two and said you can do that if you want to keep pursuing naturalistic explanations, material explanations, but if there's evidence that some events or some objects, if it seems the evidence is better or stronger for an intelligent cause, we need to be open to intelligent causes instead of just material naturalistic causes. We need to be open to let the evidence go where it leads, and some things are better explained by intelligence. So that's been part of the debate for a long time, and the scientific community, because the scientific community is built on paradigms. Paradigms are the things that are established, like the way people think. They didn't like that, and they don't want the scientific consensus being challenged, and so there's always been debates about this, and there's ongoing debates, and there's books and books that have been written and debates and things about it, in the scientific literature and journals and things. Um, in some ways, if you look at how you define science, there's not always a universal agreement about how to define science. Most people might see it as like an organized or systematic cumulative pursuit of knowledge, because science is a type of epistemology, as we call it. Epistemology is how we know things. So science is a way we know things. It's not the only way we know things. Some people think it is, but it's really a study of the natural world, as we know, through rigorous testing of hypothesis. But what we what you don't want to do when you get in conversations with people about this is, or when you do get in conversations with people who try to say that science has gotten rid of the existence of God, is really challenging what they mean by that. Once again, you need to ask them, why do they say that? And ask them, what is science? What does science do? because science, there's different couple different issues here. There's obviously what we call methodological naturalism, which means that science studies the natural world. It looks for naturalistic explanations. That's all science can do. It's restricted by that, right? And then we have what we call metaphysical naturalism, and that's more of a philosophy. That's not science. That's more of a view of reality already, saying that, hey, the natural world is all there is. I've decided that ahead of time. There's no God, no gods, no immaterial realm. And then I'm going to come with my science and say science proves there's no natural realm or super or other thing. Science proves there's no nothing else but the natural realm. Well, you basically just argued in a circle. You started with philosophy and then you use science to prove your philosophy. Okay. And so you just need to ask people, well, how would science disprove God if it's only allowed to look for naturalistic explanations or what we call materialistic explanations? Then there's no way science could ever show God doesn't exist. It's not the tools. It doesn't have the tools to really show God exists or doesn't exist. It's set up to only look for a natural cause for everything. Just like if you use the analogy with metal detectors, if you go out on the beach and you have a metal detector and someone comes up to you and says, hey, did you find any plastic on the beach today? And he'd look at you like, why are you asking me that question? My metal detector is only designed to find metal. Okay. And that's what metal detectors are only designed to do, right? It doesn't mean there's nothing else out there like plastic on the beach or rubber or paper, but that metal detector is only designed to find metal. So you need other things to find those other things, right? You need other devices to find plastic or rubber or something like that. So when someone says that, well, science has shown God doesn't exist, that's like saying, it's like going on a beach and saying, hey, you know what? I used a metal detector only to find metal, and that's all I ever found. Therefore, there's no other materials out there. There's no plastic, there's no rubber, and there's no paper. You wouldn't say that as a rational person. You'd say, yeah, there's other materials out there. My detector, though, is only designed to find metal. Okay. And that's all metal detectors can do. So people are using the tools of science for it's really self-limiting and it's really restricted, and they're forgetting what science can and can't do. Um, Something else you always want to ask people when you're out talking, getting into discussions about science, I always say to them, what branch of science, has shown God doesn't exist? There's all kinds of branches of science. There's chemistry, there's physics, there's biology, there's geology, there's astronomy, there's the social sciences, linguistics, history, psychology, anthropology, sociology, there's engineering and computer science. So I always ask them, like, well, what branch of science has shown God doesn't exist? Do you mean all of them or one of them or which one? So just don't let people necessarily bracket you into the word science. Okay. Science, you want to say science is, okay, because there's different kinds of sciences, right? So that's just a couple strategic points I would try to remember. Okay. Now, the intelligent design movement was really catapulted by a guy named Philip Johnson. Philip Johnson was a law professor at University of Berkeley. Um, he was obviously trained in formal debate and law and knew how to look at legal, obviously legal argumentation. And he was just evaluating all the literature about Darwinism, and he realized there were some problems with it, and he found some holes in it. And he wrote a book called Darwin on Trial a long time ago. And that book became kind of famous. I mean, he wasn't a biologist, but he was able to take the material and synthesize it that most biologists said, yeah, he gets the bulk of what Darwin's saying correctly. Seems to understand it, even if they didn't agree with all his conclusions. And then he wrote a book called Defeating Darwinism by Opening Minds in the 90s as well. That became a very common textbook that was used in a lot of schools, a lot of Christian private schools, a lot of classical education. And he talked about just things that were gaps of understanding in the Darwinian model that needed to be discussed. Then he wrote some other books like The Wedge of Truth. And so his goal was to try to start to broaden the view of science that we need to allow intelligent look for intelligent causes as well, not just look for naturalistic or materialistic explanations. So he tried to broaden that, and then the intelligent design movement kind of grew and grew and grew. We had other people that were mathematicians, philosophers, biologists, chemists, starting to write books as well. William Dembski was another guy who came. He has a PhD in math and philosophy, taught at many universities, and he came up. He wrote a book called The Design Revolution, and then he wrote a basic, very general guide with Sean McDowell. You can get that book. It's probably one of the easiest introductions you could read, Understanding Intelligent Design. There's some other books, of course, that came out. There's a slew of books that really came out to explain what intelligent design was. Um, and then we had a guy named, there's a guy named Michael Behe that came out. He was a biochemist at at the university in Pennsylvania. I can't remember the name of it, but he wrote a book called Darwin's Black Box in 1996, and that really caused a stir in the scientific community. Really, really caused a stir because they just didn't like his conclusions. He was challenging the Darwinian paradigm. He wrote a response to all his critics in a book called A Mousetrap for Darwin because he did get a lot of criticisms, and he decided to put together all his answers in that book there, answering his critics. Because if you go online, people type in Behe's been refuted and Behe's wrong, but he wrote a lot of responses to his critic. He wrote most of the responses in that book, A Mousetrap for Darwin. It came out just not too long ago, I think 4 years ago or so. Then you had a book called The Design Inference that William Dembski updated. That was a big book on intelligent design that came out the last couple of years, talking about using mathematical probability and talking about design and nature. And then you had Stephen Meyer's work that he's one of the most popular writers that's come out with a lot of books over the last 10 years. Answered a lot of his critics in some of these books. But The Return of the God Hypothesis, I recommended that last week. It's probably one of the best books you can get. But he's written a lot of books too. PhD from Cambridge University, philosopher of science. That's what he does. He's an expert in philosophy of science. So intelligent design definitely has come out with the materials. You can find all their materials and information on a website called the Discovery Institute. Now, I will say that they're certainly criticized. There's plenty of, if you go online, you find people that criticize them, say they're liars, deceivers, whatever. People didn't like it that they're putting out material critiquing evolution or critiquing the limits of evolution. Of course, that's going to happen. But I can tell you that they've responded to a lot of those critiques, and most of the people involved in that movement have taken a lot of hits, a lot of persecution. They've lost teaching jobs, they've lost status, they've lost platforms because they have challenged the what we call the Darwinian paradigm. Some of them are not necessarily saying that everything about evolution is false, but they're certainly talking about things within evolution, as I'll talk about, still need to be rethought, and there's challenges to the model that's been taught over and over and over for decades, which some of the stuff's just outdated. Um, Now, last week I also talked about how intelligent design or design inferences are found in archaeology. They use it in archaeology and they find things. They can tell when intelligent mind has made something or left a design behind. It's pretty obvious. You look at a ring like this, or just about everything in the archaeological record in the Bible, which there's tons of discoveries. You can tell there's intelligence behind it. Or criminal investigators use design inferences. I talked about this, cold case investigations, things like that. They have to figure out if something happened, intentionally. Was it done by somebody else? Was it an accident, or was it necessary? Things like that. They use it in criminal investigations. I also talked about how last week how Francis Crick, who worked on the DNA very early on in his career, he talked about one of his sayings was that biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they see was not designed, but rather evolved. He talked about how that was just a presupposition of biology. I also discussed how Richard Dawkins, one of the most famous atheists in the last 30 years, said in his book, The Blind Watchmaker, he said biology is a study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. So, he says that things in biology look like they're designed, but they don't need a designer. He's, of course, been responded to a lot, but he's certainly one of those famous outspoken atheists of the last 30 years. Sometimes intelligent design gets the view, they get accused of what's called a God of the gaps argument. And basically people come along and say that, hey, we see something in the natural world that looks like it can't be explained alone by nature, like nature can't explain it or science can't explain it. And then you people come along and just plug God in it. You say, well, God did it. And so they sometimes say that's called a God of the gaps argument, where they say there's something like the natural phenomena, something that can't be explained at first, and then later on they'll say, but science will figure it out one day. Science will come up with the answer. That's really not God there. That we'll figure it out. Well, most people have responded to that. That's kind of what we call nature the gaps argument. That basically you're saying that, well, if God can't fill any gap, then nature can do it on its own. And basically you're just saying nature will figure it all out. But it's not really correct because, see, whatever you want to say nature does, the mechanisms of nature, it's not really hard to say that there's a mind behind the world of nature. Okay. So, scientists can study all day long how things work, and they can study how the cell works and how the universe works and how the human body works, and study the complexity of cells and DNA and how all those mechanisms work. But it doesn't mean there's no mind behind the mechanisms. Okay. We believe that God created the natural world. He's the mind behind nature. So by all means, go study the world of nature and explore it. And he can certainly use nature for his purposes. But it doesn't really do any good sometimes to just say, well, science will figure it out one day, when science is only restricted to find a natural cause anyway. Science is set up to only find natural causes. So it's kind of restricted anyway. So a lot of intelligent design scholars have responded to that, the God of the gaps arguments, but just wanted you to be aware of that. Now, I said last week, well, I didn't quite get into a couple of these, but I talked a little bit last week about one of these. So we call anticipatory complexity, which is the fine tuning argument. There's also what's called irreducible complexity and specified complexity. Now, some Christians will say at times that we know God exists by the complexity of everything. They'll say everything's just so complex. I understand what they're saying, but sometimes you have to be a little more specific. Okay, it helps, to come up with a little more nuanced terminology. So sometimes I might say there's something we call anticipatory complexity, that the universe has been thought out or planned ahead. It's been something, someone has anticipated it. Or what we call irreducible complexity, which I'll talk about in a minute, and then specified complexity. Now, last week I talked a little bit about anticipatory complexity. I talked about how before you could even get to biological evolution, if someone wants to debate with you evolution, my response is always like, well, what do you mean? You mean like biological evolution? Is that what you mean? Because before you even get to biological evolution, you've got to have a universe that permits this, that is hospitable to life. You've got to have a universe that is set up precisely for life to get going on Earth. There's no Earth getting going if there's no universe that got going before the Earth. Okay, so you need the right universe. Then you need an Earth that is precisely set up for life on Earth, is precisely set up to get life going. And then you need to show how life began. You need to show how life even got started. How would lifeless matter give rise to life? How would non-life give rise to life? And we have not figured out the origin of life. Nobody, to say they figured it out, you're either ignorant or you just don't keep up with the literature. But they don't know how the origin of life started. Of course, we say God did it, but in science they don't really have a naturalistic explanation. They used to say, well, there was called the Miller-Urey experiment. They tried to say, they reduplicated the conditions on Earth, and they figured out they got some gases and amino acids going in the lab that they could repeat the conditions, but that didn't work. There was a lot of problems with that, and that got kind of refuted. So they're still working on it, trying to figure out how naturalistically life could get going. They can do that all they want, but that's they're still having to say, you can't even get to biological evolution until you figure out how life began. Okay. And then I talked a little bit about the fine tuning of the universe, that there's not a lot of debate that the universe is fine tuned. That basically our universe is like a biosphere, analogous to a biosphere, right? So, and then I talked a little bit last week about this. The fine tuning argument started a long time ago. It started in the physics journals, as I mentioned last week. It's not a religious argument. It started in physics, and basically, a few physicists like these guys came out with their books who weren't even Christians, talking about the issue a long time ago. And then the as far as the Earth, there was a book called Rare Earth that came out a ways back, talking about why our Earth is unique, and why we're just not like many other planets. Even though people say they keep finding Earth-like planets, doesn't seem to be really true. To be just like Earth takes a lot of, you have to figure out a lot of things if we have an exact Earth-like planet. But there's been other books like Hugh Ross's book talking about how the Earth's environment is perfectly set up as well to get life going on Earth. It takes a lot to build a universe and to build a planet. You want to plan out a universe and build a planet, that takes some planning. Okay. I don't know what you guys think, but any kind of planning it takes on our planet, such as our own planning, such as governmental planning, which they fail, of course, at, and such as other planning, just planning in general on Earth, multiply what that would take to pull off a universe or pull off a planet. If you think there's planning here being done or foresight, think about what it would take to build the kind of planning it would take to get a universe and to get an Earth going. That would require some serious foresight and planning. Okay. Probably beyond anything that a human could ever do. Okay. So for those that say that chance does it, that chance is just we're a lucky accident, I challenge that. Okay. I really want you to think through that. Either do you really have the information? Do you have the correct information? Okay. And then there's another guy named Michael Denton who released a book called Nature's Destiny. And he talked about how the laws of nature, like the laws of biology, reveal goal directness. So everything's going towards a goal. Like there's nature, these things are they're like planned out. Like they're there for a reason. They have a specific purpose. So they have a goal. They're not just mindless or blind or undirected. And Michael Denton is more like I think he's some kind of deist or something. I don't think he's a Christian, but he believes in some sort of designing intelligence. Um, and he believes in some kind of evolution too, but he definitely does not see nature as just goalless and it's just blind and it just has no purpose to it. He says everything, water, light, carbon, nitrogen, everything has a very specific goal that has been built in the fabric of the universe. Okay. I said last week also that many non-Christians who are physicists believe the universe is fine-tuned. They don't really debate so much whether the universe is set up for life. They just debate why it's fine-tuned, like what caused it. Obviously, if some of them are atheists or skeptics, they're probably not going to posit there is a God behind it. It's just their worldview won't allow them to. Okay. So, but it's not a lot of debate whether the universe is fine tuned. Maybe a couple holdouts that don't think the universe is fine tuned, which has been responded to. Um, Sometimes they view the fine tuning as what's called the anthropic principle. Um, it just basically states that our universe depends on numerous cosmological constants and parameters whose values must fall within a very narrow range of values. And I talked about that last week a little bit. And it seems like those constants are precisely set up. I mean, they're fine tuned very carefully for us to exist. Okay, that's what we talk about. You say like it's called the anthropic principle. Okay, now there's a couple of atheists who did say the fine tuning argument is a very strong argument for a God. Christopher Hitchens was an atheist. He passed away of cancer about 10 years ago. Very famous atheist. He said the fine tuning argument is intriguing. There's a physicist named Sean Carroll that exists. He's alive right now. Um, He thinks it's one of the best arguments that Christians have for God. Obviously, he tries to come up with naturalistic explanations, and then he's been responded to. But many atheists have responded the fine tuning argument is certainly something that is a formidable argument. Um, there are the two biggest objections to fine tune. I just want to mention. Sometimes I run into this. There's something we call the selection effect or the puddle analogy. You may have never heard of this. Of course, I understand. Some people say that when you find a puddle, or when you find a hole in the ground, or like a street somewhere like this, you find puddle or you find holes in general, like craters or you know areas of roads that need to be repaired, whether it be in the sidewalk or the road or the concrete. Generally, as it rains, you're going to find a puddle. Puddles are very common, right, in those holes. That's just the way it works. Um, and some people say that, well, um, the water just fits the puddle. The puddle is there, and the hole is just this. The hole just fits the puddle, or vice versa. The hole's just set up to fit the water in the puddle. And the hole just happens to be there, and the hole works perfectly, and the water goes in it from the rain, and here you have a puddle, and you can observe it, and there's no reason why we don't need to posit a reason for that puddle, why it fits that hole just right. Okay, it just is. Okay. And they try to use that as an analogy for the fine tuning argument, saying that, well, we shouldn't be surprised we have a life emitting universe because we're here to observe it. I mean, if we didn't exist, we wouldn't be here to observe it. We're here to observe it. Therefore, it just is. It's just the way it is. We don't need to posit an explanation for it. Just like the puddle is there, it fits the hole. We don't need to posit an explanation for it. It just is. It's a bad analogy because that obviously what they're saying is even if you change the shape of the hole, right, when you're looking at a puddle, the shape of the puddle it changes, but you always get a puddle, right? No matter how big that hole is, how small it is, you're always going to get a puddle, right? But the shape of the hole is irrelevant. Like I'm saying, the shape of the hole is irrelevant to the existence of a puddle. The problem is that when it comes to the universe, that life cannot exist in just any universe, okay? It has to exist in a certain kind of universe. You can't just come up with any universe, okay? And it's going to, if you come up with a different universe, it's going to change whether we exist right now, okay? So the analogy doesn't really hold, okay? Yes, you can change the shape of a hole for a puddle once again, and you'll still have the existence of a puddle, right? But you can't you can't just flip around different universes and expect that we're going to be here right now talking. You have to have a certain kind of universe. Okay, you have to have a very specific kind of universe, a very specific kind of life prohibiting universe. Okay, that has certain kind of constants that are set a certain way. So the pedal analogy doesn't work, but some people try to use that. Another explanation a lot of people come up with is a multiverse theory. Sometimes they say, there's a bunch of universes out there. There's a multitude of universes that were formed randomly, and our universe has happened to be one of these universes, and somehow, some way, out of the millions or billions of universes, we just got lucky. One of them popped out, and one of them we just happened to get fortunate. The problem with this theory is we haven't observed any of these other universes. They're not observable, so there's no observational evidence to support this. It's all theoretical. And secondly, even if you got a bunch of other universes, I don't know. You'd have to ask, well, what caused all those universes? There's some sort of universe generator out there that's producing these universes, and how did they not all collide? And if they're all fine tuned, then how did they get fine tuned? But the biggest problem is we just don't have any observational evidence for any of the universes. It's all theoretical. As Paul Davies says, it's a dodge. He's a kind of like a deist. He says it's just a dodge to avoid the fine tuning argument. Now, you might want to say also that the universe is very specified. It's what we call specified complexity, where, or no, I'm sorry, a good analogy would be if you took this guy shooting this bullseye with the arrow at these two bullseyes right here, the two targets, and then you threw a blind man there in front of him and you had him shoot, or right, if he went right in front of the target and the guy happened to miss him with the arrow over and over, the guy with the blindfold eventually would say, "Why are you missing me?" He'd ask, "Why are you missing me?" Okay, you know what I mean? I'm right in front of you. I'm right in front of the target, and you keep missing me. If you're aiming at me, and you keep missing me, it's like asking, when you say the universe, we don't need an explanation for the fine tune. You're saying I don't need to know why. That's what we do. We ask, why is it fine tuned? We don't just say, well, it's just fine tuned. It's just the way it is. Okay, it doesn't. It's really most people are going to ask why it is that way. Okay. Now there's another argument, as I mentioned before, that formed the basis for the intelligent design movement. One of them is called the irreducibly complex argument. It was given by a guy named Michael Behe, who's a biochemist, and he came out with this book in 1996. I remember I bought it when it came out. He got a lot of criticism and a lot of hatred in the scientific community because he was challenging the paradigm of the Darwinian model. And basically, he introduced this thing called irreducible complexity, and he said that something is irreducibly complex if it's composed of two or three or more necessary parts. Okay, that's what he said. If you remove one part in function, it's not just impaired, but it's destroyed. Okay, and then he gave this illustration of a mousetrap. And he said that when you look at a mousetrap, it has all these different parts, right? It doesn't work unless all the parts are in place. You can't remove one of them, expect it to work. So he talked about how that basically he's using an analogy is that natural selection could not couldn't build things gradually, like everything had to be in place at once for certain biological things to work. They couldn't just like natural selection couldn't build them piece by piece. And so he gave an example of the rotary flagellum, some of these other things. Actually, I have I want to start. I have something I want to show you really quick, if you don't mind. Let's uh, let's do this. See if we can show this really quick. Do I have it? Yeah, let's show this real quick. If you can see this all. This is the flagellum. Except I don't know how to make you. There it is. Hold on. I have to shut this off. Okay, you can't hear it. So never mind. I was wondering about that, and I'm glad I asked Larry because you can't even hear it. So that's irrelevant. Okay. Well, maybe I'll send that out as a video. Back to this. Thank you for telling me, but I tried. I don't have time to fix that right now to figure that out. I just don't have the time. But I know there's a way you can do it on my computer, and I don't remember what it is, and I don't have time to figure that out right now. So anyway, so I'll send the video out later. So basically, um, Behe talked about these things that the natural selection couldn't build piece by piece. Okay, and like if you look at like our cells, your molecular, like really molecular machines, um, they're like miniature motors. They all work together, like all the parts have to be in place. And so basically, he was saying how it'd be very hard for natural selection to build these things piece by piece. Okay. For this to work, all the pieces have to be in place at one time. Okay. In order to work. So that was kind of his argument. There's more to it. but you can, take an example of an eye. Um, it's composed of several parts, all these parts, all these things have to come together. They all has to be there for it to work. And so basically, you'd be saying like a thoughtless, mindless act developed all these parts individually on their own, right? When they all have to be together at the same time to work correctly. So that was kind of Behe's argument, the irreducibly complex argument. And as I said, there were some objections to it. And then he responded to all those objections in his book, Behe and His Critics, that came out about 3 years ago. He's got a lot of other books he's written, but he did respond to those arguments, the objections. So that was what we call like an irreducibly complex argument. And wait, can everyone hear me now? I assume you can hear me right now, right? Not the video, but you can hear me again? Yes? Can someone put yes in the chat room? Can you hear me now? Okay, thank you. Just making sure. Okay. And then oops, hold on here. And then Michael or Stephen Meyer came along, and then he really worked on what was called the DNA argument, the information theory argument. And basically, he talked about how your DNA is like basically your DNA is a set of instructions needed for life. It's like the instruction manual that tells your cells what to do. And he said that, well, actually, Bill Gates and Richard Dawkins both said that DNA, well, Bill Gates said DNA is like a software program. And then Richard Dawkins said it's like the genetic code is like a digital code. It's basically the same as a computer code. So you have like a computer code in your body right now. That's almost identical to a computer code. And so basically, you have this letter sequencing here, and if you ever look up your DNA, there's tons of these letters. I mean, the genetic code is huge. You'd have to look it up online. Just a picture of the entire genetic code is fascinating. But basically, the sorry, I can't see here. Something's blocking my screen. The letters that comprise the DNA encodes the information alphabetic or alphabetic or digital form, and then a protein for protein folding to occur, it has to be in a very specific sequence. Okay, and so you need you'd almost have to say that nature by itself self-organizes information. Okay, and so basically Meyer comes along and says, is there some sort of way that nature on its own could combine these amino acids into sophisticated protein machines? Okay, and so what happened was, if you look at this right here, if you go back here, the genes contain instructions for making the proteins, right? And then you have to have that in place before any of these other things take place, the instructions. So what I'm trying to get at now is, where does that instruction manual come from? Where does that instructions, what is the origin of those instructions? Okay. Because if you look at instructions, if the DNA is an instruction manual, that's information. That's what instruction manuals have. They have information. And the problem is that if you ever look at an analogy like, I used to build houses, and whenever I go to build a house, I used to get a blueprint. This is before computers were around that were doing this. And I go pick up my set of blueprints from my architect, and the architect drew out the house. But see, before that architect drew the blueprint, the information was in his mind. It was stored in his mind. And then he wrote out the blueprint, right? And those are the instructions about how to build the house. And I would hand that blueprint to the framers and all the subcontractors. But the point is that information was stored in the mind of the architect to begin with, okay? And so very similar to when a programmer writes instructions for a computer. Before that programmer writes the instruction or code, before they write code, the information was in the programmer's mind, okay? So if you think about that, the analogy is that instructions of any kind have information in them, and information always comes from a mind or intelligence. Okay. That has to happen before the instructions even start to be used, right? And so What we're saying is that it's very hard to say if DNA encodes information, where does that information come from? Can't come from natural selection. Natural selection can only work with what information is there to begin with. Natural selection doesn't create any new information, it works with existing information. So there was a guy named Perry Marsh who wrote a book called Evolution 2.0. And he gave, I think he said he would give out $40,000 for anybody that could figure this out, figure out the riddle, this who, where that information came from. I don't know whether anybody got the prize or not. I think they tried. I don't really, I'd have to look it up. But um, basically, the argument is that Meyer came up with is that basically his big argument is that you're going to have a hard time saying that the DNA instruction manual in your body didn't come from a mind. Okay, the DNA is the set of instructions needed for life. Okay, and since it is a digital code, how would a digital code come from a naturalistic process? How does nature by itself create an instruction manual on its own? Natural selection doesn't do it. Natural selection has to work with what's there. This is before natural selection anyway. You have to have all this in place to have life started in the first place. So that was another what we call a specified complexity argument. Let me mention a few things about evolution. Whenever you're talking about evolution, remember that evolution's now become a worldview. It used to start out as a way to explain biological change. Now it's being used to explain everything. It's being used to explain religion, evolutionary view of religion. It's being used to explain sociology. It's being used to explain all human behavior. It's being used to explain cognitive science. I mean, there's cognitive science. There's everything is really, evolution has become this entire worldview to do more evolution. There's evolutionary psychology, so it just grew into this giant worldview. And whenever you're talking about evolution, you always want to get people to define what they mean by evolution. There's many definitions of evolution. Don't let anyone say to you, evolution, do you believe in evolution? And if you don't believe in evolution, you're an idiot, might they say. Um, there's about 6 or 7 different definitions of evolution, but the most common ones are these three. Okay. Evolution definition number one is change over time. The life forms we see today are different from the life forms that existed in the distant past. This can refer to minor changes in featured of individual species, changes which take place over a short amount of time. I don't have any problem with that. That's obviously a common fact. That's pretty observable. No problem with that. Evolution definition number two is common ancestry, that all organisms we see today are descended from a single common ancestor in a distant past. The claim we know is theory of universal common descent. Paints a picture of history of life on Earth as a great branching tree. There's controversy about that. That's still debated. Contrary to what people say, I can tell you it is. And then number three, of course, is heavily debated. If you say evolution is simply natural selection acting on random mutations, is an unguided and purposeless mechanism of change as primary driving force, ability, and complexity of life. So I always say to skeptics that, yeah, natural selection takes place. Definitely it happens. No doubt about that. Random mutations take place. But natural selection can't explain the diversity of life, and it can't explain the complexity of life on its own. Okay. And I'll show you something else. I have a book by these authors called What Darwin Got Wrong. They're both cognitive scientists and philosophers. They're both staunch atheists. And they basically, in their book, they basically say that the theory of natural selection is irredeemably flawed. Okay, look what this book I have it. It's not too long ago they wrote it, but they say here, in fact, we don't know very well how evolution works, nor did Darwin, nor as far as we can tell, does anybody else. The straightforward single level theory, similar to Newton's law of gravity, is going to be able to explain what is observed in natural history. Rather, they contend a multi-level. These are the authors. They contend a multi-level explanation is necessary. A simplistic theory such as natural selection cannot be an adequate solution. And there's another guy named James Shapiro, who's not a Christian, came out with a book called Evolution, A View from the 21st Century. He rejects the old paradigm, the old evolutionary model that's still taught in universities. He says that he rejects the foundational neo-Darwinian tenet that evolutionary change comes about by stochastic mutations as a determination in the late 19th, 20th centuries. In the 19th, 20th centuries, he says here living cells do not operate blindly. They continue to acquire information, make adjustments, self-regulate, self-correct. Um, so he's basically saying the evidence points to rapid, non-random, non-Darwinian change. Now, he doesn't believe in God, but he's saying that the model that people have been taught needs to be revamped. We need to rethink it. It's just outdated. A guy named Thomas Nagel, another atheist, teaches at the University of New York, wrote a famous book called Mind and Cosmos: Why the Materialist Neo-Darwinian Conception of Nature is Almost Certainly False. He said Darwinianism cannot explain the existence of consciousness in higher order animals, then it is even more incapable of providing a naturalistic explanation for the cognitive abilities of human beings. Why does mathematics work, and how is it human brains, which supposedly evolved simply so their owners could gather food and reproduce, are able to comprehend math? Evolution via natural selection does and cannot supply an answer. He's a atheist professor at University of New York. He may be retired now. Some of the problems with evolution have always been the fossil record. Stephen Meyer wrote a lot about this in the book Darwin's Doubt. He talked about how um, the fossil record doesn't show a ton of like broken up pieces where everything's like there's not a lot of transitional forms. They're mostly the fossil record shows a lot of species already together in one place. They're one organism. All the pieces are together. They're not like broken up into different transitions. And that's the way the fossil record shows. A lot of them appeared abruptly all in one piece. Okay, that's what he was talking about in the book Darwin's Doubt. Okay, and then he responded to criticisms in a book he wrote as a response. So that's always been a challenge for the standard evolutionary model. The tree of life issue was something that that they tried to come up with. That there's an ancestral relationship between all the organisms based on one gene or biologically characteristic variably conflict with trees based on different gene or characteristics. So that that has not really been shown to be the case. A tree of life, some sort of tree of life, like they haven't been able to show that as being rock hard, solid evidence either. Um, there's a lot of breakdown in common descent, and the tree of life's been kind of contested a lot. So that hasn't really worked out as a rock solid argument that we have like a tree of life. Um, the other issue is the mutations in genetics. They tend to cause harm and do not build complexity because evolution relies a lot on random mutations that are preserved by an undirected process, right? But mutations tend to harm organisms and don't like create new body plans. Okay, they don't create or build new complexity. So they don't create new species. So there's a challenge in that area too with the issues of mutations, saying that they can just do everything. Now, let me. Oh, by the way, did you ever say to yourself, how could a thoughtless process, an unguided, undirected process, anticipate the reproductive system? Like how a man and a woman could somehow just have the right equipment to make a new life. It just nature just anticipated that on its own. It just knew how to do it without any intelligence, any God. It just figured it all out. That the reproductive system just came along, through random mutations, thoughtless mutations, and it just figured it out. I find that to be mind boggling. So there's always these design arguments in biology. This is what we call the origin of life issue, which I talked about. These the origin of the genetic code, where that comes from, the origin of new proteins, the origin of irreducible and specified complexity. There's discontinuity in the fossil record, and something called the waiting time problem. So let me mention this, because this I've shared this before, and a lot of people like to see this. So uh, these are the if you look at humans and chimps, you look at the differences we have, the different shoulders, the different rib cages, the different spines, pelvises, hips, legs, arms, hands, and feet. You can see the differences here. And when you try to, of course, chimps live in the trees. And humans, we live on the ground walking around. But if you ever ask yourself what changes would be necessary to convert an ape-like creature into a human? How do we get from an ape to human? Can natural selection or any mutation just do that? Keep doing it, and somehow we just evolve from an ape to human. These are the things you need, the kind of changes you would need. You would need a new design of a spine. You would need a new shape and a tilt to the pelvis. You would need legs that angle in from the hips. You would need knees, front feet, and toes designed for upright walking. You would need a skull that sits on the top of the spine in a balanced position. You need the shift in jaws and muscle attachments. You need a face flatten and sinuses behind the face, and the eye sockets located in different places to permit a forward gaze. Those are all the changes would need to take place. Now, you know, when this article came out a ways back in Nature, the article Nature Journal in 2004, the authors counted 16 anatomical changes necessary to convert from a ape into a human. They would require multiple mutations, multiple mutations to make that happen. And some people might come along and say, well, just give it enough time. Time can do anything. They sometimes think time is just has the power to do everything. Time is like just can do anything on its own. Um, if any of these differences are required two or more mutations before providing advantage, it's likely to have evolved in humans since our split with apes 6 to 8 million years ago. So there's a book that came out called by this book right here, who are two experts on the topic, and they basically calculated the amount of time it would take for these mutations to work, and if mutations could even do it anyway. But they basically said that we simply could not have evolved in the time scientists assigned to the split from chimps about 6 million years ago. They say many coordinated changes are required to turn an ape into a human. One of the authors, Harris, acknowledges with complex features like skeletal traits, we expect there to be many DNA changes responsible for them. We expect that these DNA changes will not have occurred only in a single gene, but numerous different genes. Mathematicians Roger Durrett and Dina Schmidt calculated to get a single mutation such a regulatory site would take 6 million years, as much time as we've got to evolve from ape to us. Even if every gene evolved simultaneously, all those mutations would need to work together to create helpful traits. Since mutations are blind to benefit and mostly harmful, as I mentioned before, and typically work against each other, simply isn't enough time for it to happen. So that's just some things to think about in that issue. Now, sometimes people come along and say, you want to give these intelligent design arguments for God, but there's so much bad design. I've got cancer, my body breaks down, the human eye doesn't work correctly, or there's some feature of our bodies that don't work perfectly, or there's something off. Wow, God could have designed us better here, or could have designed my back better, could have designed a kid that has these features, or could have designed that better. So a lot of people push back and say, there's just bad design. It can't be very intelligent, must not be very intelligent. Maybe he's like a dumb designer. Some people say that. Well, they assume, they seem to have a standard for what optimal design is. How do they know what optimal design is? Where does the standard of design come from? Where does that even come from? If you think about the Pontiac Aztec, which is an old 2001 car, it's probably the worst car that ever got invented. We obviously can look at cars and say, there's ones that could be better designed for sure, obviously. Uh, you obviously know that the Pontiac Aztec, while it's not designed well, not optimally designed well, it's still designed, right? It may not be designed as well as a 2016 Chevrolet Corvette or another car, but it's designed. Okay. So it doesn't have to be optimally designed for it to be designed. Okay. Um, Obviously, that some things that go wrong with our bodies are the result of the fall of man. We know that when sin entered in the world, that the creation is off. Our bodies are off. Everything's off. It's not what it should be. And we know that sickness has entered into the world and death has entered into the world. So some things, are not going to work well. That's why we get cancer. That's why we get sick. And that's why we die. So theologically speaking, that's a theological answer that may not satisfy some people, but that's certainly one of the reasons why our bodies don't work too well, even though they are designed. Um, and then you have, obviously, there's always design trade off. We know that, you think about laptop computers, strike a balance between size, weight, and performance. Larger cars may be more safe and comfortable, but they also more difficult to maneuver. So there's obviously going to be some features that are not going to be, there's going to be trade offs on some things. Um, Now, there has been a group of people that there's a lot of Christians. Some Christians have become theistic evolutionists. That's been around for a while, where they think God uses evolution as a mechanism to accomplish his purposes. It's not that there's no God, he just uses evolution as a mechanism. Okay. Whereas an atheist would say there is no God and the mechanism of evolution does everything on its own, which we completely disagree with. But some Christians think that God used some aspects of evolution to accomplish his purposes. Um, it's not that I wouldn't disagree that some aspects of evolution are certainly true. I mean, you can't deny natural selection, random mutation take place. You can't deny change takes place. You can't deny that some other aspects take place. But the problem is with the limits of what natural selection can do, and you can't say it explains the diversity of life. And there's debates over common descent. And there's other debates, but there's been a lot of critiques of theistic evolution. A lot of these people have written critiques of it if you want to read about it. That book, Theistic Evolution, the second one, there's one of the most detailed critiques there is. But there's certainly Christians out there that see really no debate. They don't think the evolution creation debate is really worthwhile. They think that you should just reconcile them together and move on. Now, personally, for me, when I'm talking to people on college campuses, I don't really get into the age of the earth. I don't get into certain creation models. I just, if they don't believe in God, I'm just trying to get them to believe and see the evidence that there is a God, that there's a creator. We can debate about a specific creation model later on. But, I need to get them out of their atheism or naturalism. And that's what intelligent design really does. Okay. All right. So I think I'll stop there. I know we talked about a lot, and we can just stop there.